This is part 3. This is the mystical part of it. So we'll start off with the video.
What seems to happen in the psychedelic state is that when something is positive, it has the potential to be incredibly positive, to the extent of being euphoric and ecstatic. But similarly, if something is negative, it has the potential to be quite hellish and dysphoric and frightening. Psilocybin is found in magic mushrooms, and it's a compound that is broken down in the body into another compound which is very, very similar to a naturally occurring neurotransmitter in the brain or chemical messenger in the brain, and that's called serotonin. Now, their pharmacology is subtly different, but what's so interesting about this drug is that that subtle difference in its pharmacology confers profound effects on consciousness.
Our first study was published in 2006 in healthy volunteers who received psilocybin or a comparator drug. This was all in a blinded fashion under optimally supported conditions in which they lay down on a couch, had eye shades on, headphones through which they listened to a program of recorded music. They were in the presence of 2 people with whom they had already developed a trusting relationship. Under those conditions, a high percentage of people end up reporting a constellation of experiences, the most interesting piece of which is that it really falls into a category of something the psychology of religion people talk about as a primary mystical experience.
Analogy that you could use to describe how the drug affects brain activity is either to say that brain activity becomes relatively disordered or disorganized in the state. Another thing that you could say is that it's not entire disorder, that rather it's more like the brain enters a more kind of anarchic state.
It's fascinating. I think one of the interesting implications of this kind of work is that we're biologically hardwired for having these kinds of experiences. It's not just unique to mystics, you know, spending years of meditation in a cave, that this is part of the human biology to have these kind of integrative experiences that can really set the stage and the platform for remarkable personal change.
And our research has really been looking at how it works in the brain. So we've used a number of different brain imaging modalities or brain scanning modalities. One of them's functional magnetic resonance imaging, which uses high field magnets to look at changes in brain blood flow. The brain imaging work that we've done, one of the interesting findings was that there was a really quite marked decrease in brain activity in a particular region of the brain which is overactive in depression. So this region of the prefrontal cortex is typically highly active in depression, and a range of effective treatments for depression all normalize this overactivity in this region of the prefrontal cortex. And psilocybin did exactly that, and it did it very rapidly.
We're running 2 different trials now at Johns Hopkins. One is in cancer patients who are anxious or depressed secondary to their cancer diagnosis, generally a life-threatening cancer diagnosis. Although we haven't touched their disease process, they still experience the pain. They're still dealing with the fact that they're going to leave their loved ones or their children. In some cases, these are parents of kids who are young. That sadness is still there, but there's also a larger framing of that, and so it's very touching.
There's a growing consensus among scientists that drug laws and prohibition around psychedelic drugs is irrational, it's unhelpful, and potentially it's precluding people who are unwell getting effective treatments, and that's a shame.
These are remarkable compounds with, I think, remarkable implications if we can understand how they work and why they work.
So I'm going to be talking about mystical experiences. I like to say transcendence to transformation. I think that's a kind of a way of characterizing it. Specifically, what you were talking about, Ruth Ann, I'm going to be talking about how mystical experiences impact us in two domains. One, in treating addictions, and second, in using it to treat the dying, the anxiety and depression about death. Psychedelics have been referred to as existential medicine. It helps us live in the moment. For those of you that like eye candy. So this is from Dr. Roberts' recent book. Mystical experiences have the power to reframe thoughts, emotions, and identity, because that's the very essence of what we're talking about. If mystical experiences can facilitate this experience, then what if we can do it reliably chemically? Now, when we talk about mystical experiences, I want to be able to talk about them in a subjective way. And Dr. Roberts' class actually came up with the acronym for this, pot music, with 2 T's, okay? So this way you can remember it yourself. And we're going to go into this at length here. So these are the subjective experiences that make it mystical, starting out with paradoxicality. When we talk about paradoxicality, we're talking about things that are essentially conflicted, and they become parts of a whole, like the concept of yin-yang. So this experience can combine 2 conflicted ideas as one. Objectivity. The reality is more than the ordinary experience. Transcendence, we're talking about something that we had referred to earlier, the loss of ego-centered consciousness. This is very useful from a therapeutic standpoint, and for those of you that are Freudians, the ego gets in the way. So if you have a way to reduce the ego, then you're dealing with what's left, and that can be very useful. And then transiency. Mystical experiences are short-lived. The question is how to get them to last longer. The mood is a positively felt mood, one of the characteristics. Sacredness, the sense of awe being attached to a greater cause. This feeling that it's something more than just yourself, that you're part of a bigger picture, this idea of sacredness. Ineffability, beyond words. So many of these experiences are very hard to characterize in words. And when some of the initial research happened in the 60s, the early researchers didn't even have oftentimes the words that described them. They had to go to some of the ancient Eastern texts to be able to come up with expressions, the Bardo states and so forth. And then finally, changes. What we're looking here is the fact that altered traits, hopefully, altered traits can result from altered states. So it's not about the altered state alone, but it's to be able to facilitate an altered trait. Transpersonal experiences provide an opportunity. For those of you that were around the first time, I tweaked Timothy Leary's famous mantra, which got us into a lot of trouble. I say, turn on, tune in, transcend. And by the way, all the artwork is compliments of Alex Gray. So this begins with the miracle at Marsh Chapel. This took place in 1962. 20 divinity students were given either the placebo or psilocybin. This was on Good Friday, and what they did is they were in a chapel, and a very charismatic preacher talked about Good Friday, and half had the placebo and half had the psilocybin. The conclusion was those that received the psilocybin experienced to a greater extent than did the controls described by our typology of mysticism. So those that had the psilocybin had a mystical experience, more so than those that were given the placebo. So the question is, can you have a mystical experience in the pill? That was the question at the time. I found the original Time magazine quote on this, which I thought was most interesting. All students who had taken the drug experienced a mystical consciousness that resembled those described by saints and ascetics. So this was the report after the research in 1966 as reported by Time magazine. So in 1991, Dr. Doblin, the most associated with starting MAPS, said that all psilocybin subjects participating in the follow-up still considered their original experiences to have genuinely mystical elements and to have made a uniquely valuable contribution to their spiritual lives. So again, this reference of a chemical resulting in a mystical experience that impacted them spiritually. A long-term follow-up interview quote was, "Something extraordinary had taken place. I felt drawn out into infinity. I was caught up in the vastness of creation, huge, as the mystics say." So something happened here. The subjective experiences that we talked about earlier that make up the characteristics of a mystical experience were clearly being demonstrated here. So fast forward to the present. This is the ad for the original dose-response study on psilocybin at Johns Hopkins University, seeking persons committed to spiritual development to participate in a research study of mystical experience, meditation, and spiritual practice. Volunteers who have an active interest in exploring and developing that spiritual lives to participate in a scientific study of the combined effects of meditation, spiritual practice, and the entheogen, psilocybin, a psychoactive substance found in mushrooms used as a sacrament in some cultures. So they're putting the psilocybin in the context of an entheogen. It is being looked at in the way the indigenous cultures had used this as kind of a mystical experience. So this is not something, they weren't facilitating recreational use, they're looking for people that were interested in spiritual development. I think the conclusion of this research is most aptly characterized by the title of the journal article. Psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. I think that says it all. Roland Griffiths reported that people felt a sense of sacredness accompanied by deep feelings of gratitude, awe, love, and peace. It was inevitable and difficult, if not impossible, to describe in words. Again, this characteristic of an experience that was beyond words. This is something that transcends that. 80% reported an increase in the sense of well-being, life satisfaction, and positive outlook, which was corroborated by friends and family. So this was not just something that people felt themselves, this was something that family members also witnessed and corroborated. So here's some of the commentaries about this. This is from Roland Griffith, one of the researchers. And we had talked about this in one of the earlier presentations. We're basically biologically wired for this. It's a biologically normal phenomenon that we're talking about. Dave Nichols, who is also a chemist that makes some of the research chemicals, said psilocybin occasion experiences similar to a spontaneously occurring mystical state. And then our very own Dr. Harriet DeWitt, who, as we sit here, is running psychedelic research at the University of Chicago, says it's time for psychopharmacologists to open their minds in the laboratories to the full domain of the human drug experience. So it's time to stop the nonsense. We're not talking about drugs of addictions. We're talking about drugs with the potential to heal. So I want to talk about the use specifically of Ibogaine in treating opiate addiction, because I think this is a good case for a mystical experience facilitating an altered state, facilitating a change in trait. So what is Ibogaine? Ibogaine is a psychoactive indole alkaloid that's derived from the root bark of something that grows in equatorial Africa, the African iboga plant. So looking at Ibogaine as a treatment for opiate is a way to transform the person that has the addiction. A little bit of background about how we came to find out about Ibogaine. This is used by the Fang tribe in equatorial Africa. It is the Bwiti cult. They use the hallucinogenic plant as their sacrament and initiation rite. So this is an actual psychedelic religion that has been around using the iboga plant as their communion. The Bwiti and the Bwiti cult refers to the divinity portion of it and also to the manifestation of the divinity in terms of the sculpture post in the temple. When people were colonialized, in order for the native religion to stay in place, what they would have to do is become a syncretic religion. They would have to incorporate their religion in with, oftentimes the easiest way to do it is to incorporate it within the calendar of the religious, of the dominant religious culture. So that's what the Bwiti cult did. They used the religious calendar similar to the Catholic one, and then, as I said, the Iboga acted as a communion during the holidays. So they were able to stay under the radar by following the same traditions, but substituting the Iboga plant for the communion of the Catholic religion. So the fact that the applicant ingests a huge amount, what we would call a heroic dose of Ibogaine, makes this a complete psychedelic religion. So this is a religion founded on the idea of having a complete psychedelic experience. And this is considered to be the moment of the greatest illumination, and also should be taken into consideration for the rest of the initiate's life. Very similar to baptism in some of the Christian faiths, but from a different perspective. So Ibogaine as a treatment began with an addict, Howard Lotsof. In 1962, Howard Lotsof was on a quest for some more ways to get high. And he came across Ibogaine, and he tried it, and something unexpected happened. He experienced an elimination of his opiate symptoms, and he didn't have opiate withdrawal. So he realized that something happened here, and then he refined a protocol using Ibogaine to treat addicts. So what happens, and this is something that Ruth had talked about, what happens under the influence of Ibogaine when you're treating addiction? Well, first off, is the attenuation of withdrawal symptoms, and this is anywhere from a day to several days to several months, because the big part about having a problem with opiates is that the withdrawal is pretty uncomfortable. So here you have a hallucinogenic substance that attenuates the withdrawal symptoms. It also gives you the psychedelic trip, an oneric life review very similar to REM dreams. And then there is some evidence of the reset of the addictive cycle, and I'm going to talk about this. So once you've had this experience, somehow it resets the addictive cycle. Ibogaine, and this has been told to me by the experts, is an addiction interrupter. Unlike methadone and Suboxone, this isn't a substitution therapy, this isn't a blocking therapy, this is an addiction interrupter. So you can divide, in very gross terms, the trip itself, the experience, into 3 stages. The first stage is the acute phase. It takes place 1 to 3 hours after ingestion, and it lasts 4 to 8 hours. And basically what this is it's a panoramic readout of long-term memory. The second stage that follows, 4 to 8 hours after ingestion, lasting 8 to 20 hours, you experience a volume of biographical material, and it starts to slow. It's like watching a movie that's about your life that slows down, that gives you time to reflect and be able to see the perspective that how you have arrived where you're at. And finally, the last phase, 12 to 24 hours after ingestion, lasting for anywhere from 1 day to 3 days, is the last phase, this residual stimulation phase. The experience starts to lessen, you start to return to baseline, and there is some report a reduced need for sleep. So it's the processing part that occurs as part of this experience. So the question then is, how does this work? We don't quite know, because Ibogaine research is not allowed to take place legally in the United States. So we're forced to look at some of the treatment modalities, which I'm going to talk about, in other countries. So one of the hypotheses is the idea that it facilitates the plasticity in the brain that can help reconsolidate learning, because this is very tied in with the addiction. The drug-related cues, the obsessive motivational state, this allows the separation of these two states, and also the unlearning of drug-reinforcing pathways in the brain. It also reduces the dopamine efflux in the nucleus accumbens. This is, for those of you that are addiction specialists, this is the reinforcing part of the addiction. So it reduces the flow of dopamine and also diminishes the acquisition of place preference associated with drugs of abuse. So in a very behavioral sense, it breaks that classical conditioning that you start to feel when you start to approach the place that you ingest whatever it is that you're doing. It starts to break that down, that place preference. And the interesting thing about it is that it appears to normalize the transmission of the opiate through the opiate receptor. So rather than blocking or stimulating it, it actually normalizes it, and that is thought to be how this addictive cycle is reset. And then individuals who are detoxed with a single dose of Ibogaine do not go back into withdrawal. So imagine you have this drug that stops the withdrawal symptoms and gives you a 3-day panoramic readout in slow motion initially of your life, so that you can review this and put it in perspective, so that when you return to baseline without your withdrawal symptoms, you're able to process it. So it's pretty amazing. Here's a quote from Erowid, from an Ibogaine experience, and again, this describes a mystical experience. I got a glimpse then of the whole universe revolving in a giant circle, and I realized that there is no beginning and no end. It's all a big cycle we go through until we reach higher stages of evolution. So to look at how this is used to treat addicts, I'm going to explain to you how the Pangea Biomedics approach, which is just outside of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, how they treat people with opiate addictions. It started with the Ibogaine Association, which was founded in 2000, and then in 2006 was bought by Claire Wilkins, who's run it since. She is a former methadone patient who got clean with Ibogaine, and then renamed the association, the clinic, Pangea Biomedics. This is from their website. It's a highly individual and sacred experience with one common theme: an apparent reprieve from physical and psychological addiction. So this is like their mission. What comes up in Ibogaine treatment is no different than what comes up in therapy. You have things like sexual trauma, unprocessed memories, unmourned grief, and then also any kind of relationship dynamics that could include that with a therapist. So the approach that Pangea uses is very holistic, and it's not, and here, for the people that are in the addictions field, it's not the disease model. So it is not that you have this disease called alcoholism or opiate addiction. It's more about the mystical experience, much like the near-death experience, much like rebirth, and then you acknowledge this as part of the aftercare, the fact that you've had this rite of passage. This is something that they took from the indigenous cultures. So not the disease model, but instead looking at this as an opportunity to rebirth yourself. okay, in kind of mystical terms, and change. So this is a quote from Claire Wilkins' presentation at a recent psychedelic conference in 2010. I was completely perfect and whole, connected to everything, no beginning and no end, a complete sense of true wisdom. So this is something that many of the addicts are searching for, this kind of empty space in their soul that potentially could be filled by the mystical experience facilitated by Ibogaine. So MAPS is currently looking at long-term effects of Ibogaine treatment, but again, because it's not legal in the United States, they've gone to other countries like Mexico and New Zealand. The one thing that we've learned from the 60s and the 70s, if it doesn't happen here, we can study it in other countries and bring it back to try to get approval in this country. So just because it's not happening here doesn't mean that it won't. So now I want to talk about using the mystical experience in helping people at the end of life. I'm talking about psychedelic-assisted therapy for the dying. And once again, from Dr. Roberts' fine book, which I highly recommend you read, Transpersonal States of Consciousness Can Restore a Lost Sense of Wholeness and Personal Integrity. Imagine that taking a chemical could result in this feeling and restoring this loss that has been part of your life. This quote is taken from Aldous Huxley, who was the first person known to have used psychedelics at the end of his life. Aldous Huxley was a British author. And he said, and I thought he put it quite aptly, the living can do a great deal to make the passage easier for the dying. We can raise the most purely physiological act of human existence to the level of consciousness and perhaps even to spirituality. So an opportunity to make something that's medicalized into a spiritual experience. This would be something that would go very well with hospice. So let's look at the Western view of death. Basically, the Western view of death is a bad trip, okay? It's not a natural part of human existence. We deny it. We paint people up, put them in a coffin, and make them look alive. They're not alive. They're dead. Okay? So it's medicalized. Biology triumphs over spirituality. You keep the person alive at all costs, even if it's uncomfortable. In our very city of Chicago in 1964, at the Chicago Medical School, just when the research was starting to get into full throttle, Cast and Collins came up with the idea of using LSD as an analgesic to people that are dying. They thought, well, the characteristics of LSD, it produces body image distortion. It also alters body boundaries and interferes with the ability to concentrate. So what happens if we give it to people that are dying and in a lot of pain? Maybe it will help relieve the pain. So they were uncertain. What they found, most curiously, is that the people that had pain relief had experienced oceanic feelings. This feeling, the mystical experience that I talked about earlier, lasting up to 12 days. This resulted in the relief of physical and emotional pain. So just having this experience, this mystical experience, relieved their physical and emotional pain for a period of time. And what they found, and this continues to this day with the research, is that when you treat people this way, they die in less pain, emotionally and physically, and they're more conscious to the death process. Because what do? We narcotize people. We make them oblivious to the process. So here you have something that doesn't make you oblivious to the process, that makes you more aware of the moment that you're in and can give you a spiritual experience. So this is the first time that a transcendent experience was associated with the relief of physical and mental pain. And as I said, this is the premise of the research we're talking about now. This research paved the way for what is one of the longest sustained research periods focused on the dying and other psychiatric conditions at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center with Stanislav Grof and Pankey was one of the people that did the psilocybin experiment in Marsh Chapel, along with the other researchers. They were looking at 350 micrograms or more of LSD. Now, keep in mind, a street dose of LSD is 80 to 100 micrograms, so this is starting with 3.5 times the dose. The basic premise here is that you give people a single overwhelming experience that can produce a dramatic change in the way the person sees himself in the world. This is very analogous to Abraham Maslow's idea of a peak experience. So we can chemically, reliably induce a peak experience because we're talking about something that's basically dose response and give a person this experience that can be life-changing. So the person felt allied with a higher power after this. They may feel the self as part of a larger pattern. Again, so as Dr. Roberts said, is you take off your identity as a coat, and what remains is part of the universe. Okay, and it's a very transcendent experience. And then also there can be a sense of cleansing, a release that comes with it, and joy that's associated with it, making the old woes seem trivial. Because when you see things from this perspective, not finding a good parking space is trivial. So I see psychedelic medicine as an antidote to medicalized death. Death can be a good trip. You can also practice death, both metaphorically and through near-death experience. So by practicing this, you won't be that freaked out when the time comes, in theory, because we don't know. So the psychedelic mystical experience is very similar to the things that are reported for near-death experiences. The research is being done for the most part by two large organizations, the Hefter Research Institute and the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So I want to talk about some of the research ongoing and completed. The most LSD research treating the dying was just completed in Switzerland. LSD, thanks to turn on, tune in, drop out, and Timothy Leary, has a bad stigmatization. So they took the research to Switzerland. The results are being compiled. And again, as I said, FDA will accept the results of the Swiss pilot study. So if we can't do it here, we'll do it elsewhere, bring the results back, and try to get it approved here. Completed research at Harbor UCLA using psilocybin and cancer was just completed. And these were the study results. Not surprisingly, this is something we knew back in the 60s. It's safe physiologically and psychiatrically. There's no clinically significant adverse effects, and then a reduction of anxiety and depression that can last up to 3 months, which is pretty powerful when you think of the way we look at drugs as something you have to take every day to sustain a blood level, right? For those of you that are in the field, you know what I'm talking about. So, and an improvement of mood that reached significance at 6 months. So we call that the psychedelic afterglow. So up to 6 months later, people were still experiencing the effect of what happened. The New York University School of Medicine is also doing research on advanced cancer. This is, I believe Dr. Roberts was talking about that, and also Dr. Cozy. Anxiety is the main outcome variable. Most of the subjects are hallucinogenic naive. So these are people that are not experienced in the Jimi Hendrix way. Depression, pain, the quality of life, spiritual measures, attitude toward disease progression. So these will be the things that are variables that are the focus, to see how these things are changed, how they're altered by the experience. Some of the anecdotal results, because it's not published yet, is there's clinical improvement reported by the subjects, reduction of death anxiety. That is, I believe it was Carl Jung that said that is the #1 fear that people are experiencing, and we spend the rest of our life trying to resolve this death experience. Fear of death. Reduction in overall anxiety is a side effect. Also reduction in depression. The increase in the spirituality and religious practice. People feel energized and more spiritual because of this experience. And then improvements in the existential meaning of life. Again, life becomes meaningful and not so trivial. Yes?
I know these are dying people, but are they looking for a year after, or did they end the official thing at 6 months?
Well, initially it was 6 months, but the research is moving more toward the middle now. So initially it was started with people that had 6 months left to live, but now some of the research is for people that first get the cancer diagnosis. So I'll look for that. And here is some research that they're currently recruiting for at Johns Hopkins Hospital, again paid for by the Hefter Institute with Roland Griffiths, the principal researcher. Again, looking to see if by reliably inducing a religious experience, if you can increase the spirituality and decrease the depression and anxiety around terminal illness. So the conclusion, I feel, looking at the mystical states, is that the altered states can lead to altered traits. And stay tuned, because it's just a question of money. The research, and as Dr. Roberts says, is very, very good and very prestigious coverage. The fact that we have a class in psychedelics being offered in a community college indicates that there is a change and a shift in the paradigm of accepting these substances. So does anybody have any questions? Yes?
I don't even know how to put the question, because there's so many thoughts going in my head about use of the cancer patients. The initial studies were the people that had 6 months to live. Now, when they get the diagnosis, when do they introduce the psilocybin? Is it during chemotherapy, during radiation, before surgery?
Yeah, I'm sure that's coordinated. I don't know the specific answer. I don't know if either of my colleagues know the answer. I'm sure that's coordinated with the oncologists and so forth. I think that it's nice to be able to facilitate an experience like that early on, because as some of you know and many of you may not, my academic interest in psychedelics resurged with as my mother was dying of cancer. If you Google my name, the first hit will be my master's thesis that I wrote as I watched her dying. And if there was anybody that could have used a psychedelic trip, well, I mean, she spent 7 years of anxious, tests cutting. It was awful to watch. So this kind of propelled me on this path. Yes?
Is there any thought that Ibogaine would be another psychedelic that could be used for non-opioid withdrawal situations?
It could be. There is some caveats with it. It does cause rapid heartbeat, I believe. Is that right, Dr. Cozy? There are some side effects that it has to be extremely medically monitored.
I think there have been several deaths associated with it, but I understand that when they begin Ibogaine therapy, the person can't be using opioids. And I think a couple of those, my recollection is they snuck some into the clinic and were kind of mixing, so there may be some drug interaction, but I don't know.
Yeah, so the question being, are there other uses for Ibogaine? And I would say yes, there is, but bear in mind this is a 3-day trip. And one of the things that I found out in talking to some of the people involved in the research is that you have to also pay attention to the time, because the longer the trip, the more it costs. And so that, when you have something like psilocybin, that's less, the window for its effect is less than that of LSD, which is less than that of Ibogaine. So the longer you go out, then you have to have staff there. If you got a 3-day trip, you got 3 days worth of staff, so you can imagine what that costs. So one of the things I never thought of is there's that cost factor. Any other questions? Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Walters.
I was just trying to back up some of the things you have mentioned concerning spirituality and in connection with the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, and the way the people who participate feel, and especially those who have some problem with depression and hypertension, high blood pressure, and during this period, when that expression and bringing them to a spiritual state of reflection and meditation, that sort of help reduce the tension and the depression that they go through, that increases that blood pressure.
You're exactly right.
And then after sometimes, when they begin to experience that again, they want to come and meet the priest and try to express their situation. And again, that situation, that talk is also given, and using the material thing, the wine and the bread, just try to let them know that this is what you see and you eat every day, but there is a spiritual significance behind it that is going to sustain you, or sustain you. Just explaining that to them, sort of transform or transport them from the cosmic world into the world beyond, and they try to spiritualize themselves. And those who experience some sort of nightmare or succubus and incubus and something like that, they begin to realize that they are not by themselves. There is a supernatural power that looks out for them.
Exactly.
And those who explode sometimes mentally, we try to bring in the medical people to administer the Quinemax to let them have deep sleep, and when they wake up, they begin to describe their state of mind, and we start to follow up from there. So here I see when spirituality and modern medicine can really come in partnership for the well-being of the individual.
Right. And so his question, which is actually the answer too, is that when you take care of somebody's emotional, spiritual needs, they're in less pain. I mean, I see the natural emergence of this with the hospice movement, because that's kind of an easy thing. So if you're in hospice, it would be nice if the first thing that you would have an opportunity would be to have a psychedelic experience that would prepare you for the inevitable, because when you're at hospice, you're at that point. But good point. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there any longitudinal research on the Pangea biomedics with regard to relapse?
Not yet, but MAPS is doing a very good job of tracking in Mexico, and I believe the other, I don't know if it was New Zealand or Australia, it was on the slide, so that they can do the long-term research to support. Yeah, so that's very important to do the longitudinal research so that you can see what the effects are, most definitely.
Where's MAPS?
MAPS is they're out of California. That's where their home office is. Rick lives on the East Coast, and as Dr. Roberts said, he is a Chicago Midwest creation, and so that is a good organization to belong. They provide seed money for research. It's pretty inexpensive, and then you also get their journal, which talks about some of the research that is real and proposed. There's some things on the drawing boards now using MDMA to treat what was formerly called Asperger's, to give people an empathogen and see if you can have them experience what it's like to have empathy, and then to use that as a template to refer back to, treatment of things like OCD, psilocybin to treat alcoholism. So it's about money, and that's, if you become a member of MAPS, then that goes toward research. Other questions? Yes, Marianne.
It seems that people here are ordering Ibogaine over the internet. Is there any anecdotal information on that practice?
It's dangerous because it should be medically monitored, most definitely. And people are using it underground, and that's the unfortunate thing about the war on drugs. So it's not recommended. Not recommended. I mean, I would suggest if people they could afford to go to Mexico, or even consult with. I've talked to Claire Wilkins myself. I have her phone number. So, it's the idea is to consult with people that have actual knowledge of it. So she's very receptive to phone calls, and she's a pretty astounding lady. Any other questions? Yes.
I have one. Kind of going back to what all of you doctors have been talking about. One of you, I think it was you, Dr. Roberts, who said a lot of these substances kind of amplify naturally what's already in you. If you're a happy person, you're gonna experience more, be more in touch with yourself and the universe and all that kind of thing. But then you said that these substances are never used on people with psychoses. But really, where is the line drawn? If you're just, say, a regular kind of negative, naturally kind of unhappy person, is it a bad thing to take, or is it usually still a good experience? Like it will still put them in touch with,
I'll tell you,
quote, the right things for lack of.
You know what is, because if you Google my name, you get 5 pages of hits. I inevitably get many phone calls and emails, and I end up serving the psychedelic community when they're in crisis. And what I've learned a lot from that. And what happens is a lot of the people are in a bad state, and they take a psychedelic thinking they're going to be in a better state, and then it becomes a nightmare. And then in a very behavioral sense, because I'm a behavioralist, and it becomes associated with that. I mean, I was working with a kid that had a perfect example. He took mushrooms and he had a great, mystical experience, and it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Then he came to a low point of his life, broke up with his girlfriend, his parents, he had to move out of his parents' house, he lost his job, so he went to the forest and he took mushrooms, and he had the worst experience of his life. The trees were ominous, and so I met with him a couple of times, and he kept trying to chase that first experience, and my suggestion to him was stop it, because he wanted to get back to where he was, but then when he tried it, he remembered what happened, and then he'd start to have an anxiety attack. And so because he was looking for permission from me to try it again, and I said, if you're looking for permission, it's not going to happen. I suggest you find other ways to make yourself feel better. So that is the setting that we learned, and we learned that from, you don't hear of very many bad trips anymore in the news, right? Why is that? Because people know they know about set and setting now. You don't take it on a bad day in your life. You wait. So that's why you're not seeing that. People learn how to do that, set and setting. So that is the one thing we learned. And I mean, as far as where do you draw the line, I mean, psychedelics are antipsychotics, if you think about it. So, the fear is, and it's minuscule, but, people can't have a psychotic break, and then what happens if people have had psychotic breaks? So that's why it's a rule out. Will that change in the future? I don't know, but we certainly don't want to, we certainly want to operate on the premise of do no harm. Other questions? Yes?
Tying in with what she said, most addicts, I'm thinking, are in a low place, or are you waiting until they've already gone through some type of treatment where they've changed their outlook on life already?
Yes, so the question is addicts are at a low point, and then at what point would the intervention of psychedelics be initiated? Just like anything else, they're prepared for it. And people are usually, for the most part, a lot of the things that I've read about were people that were treatment resistant, and so they were desperate to get treatment and help. But it's not something you just give without any kind of training, so there's a preparation, just like in regular therapy, kind of preparation, understanding of what you're going to be going through, the fact that there's going to be this very altered state, and then the important thing too is the aftercare thereafter to be able to integrate it. Because the other part of the equation of people that I've helped that are in trouble are people that are unable to integrate the experience, and they're trapped kind of in this state, at a party. Usually starts with alcohol, 1 drug, 2 drugs, 3 drugs later, they're out somewhere where they're not familiar, they feel dissociated from their body. The last guy I got a phone call from, and I had used a quote in an earlier presentation, not today. He felt disembodied. He felt like he was the walking dead. He was unable to kind of integrate into his body. And so he was integrating, he was using like massage and other methods that would try to kind of integrate it because he, obviously was not in, didn't know what he was doing. And so that's the other caveat there is, be careful in response to Mary Ann's question, you don't know what you're getting. When you're buying it underground, you don't know what you're getting. If it's one thing I learned from researchers is there's a big difference between ecstasy and MDMA because one is street, the other is pure pharmaceutical, so there's a big difference between that. Other questions?
Just one comment?
Yes.
So that the one, I think he was a doctor who was a heroin addict and was looking for the next high, but it actually got him over.
Yes.
That's unusual then, right? That if it worked that instantly and that well for him in that way.
Yeah, and that was an accidental response. He has since died, Howard Lotsoff, and he was just an addict. He wasn't a doctor, but he paired with doctors and researchers and came up with a protocol. But he actually took it to get high, and he ended up losing his addiction. And he was pretty astounded because many addicts know that this is, the monkey on your back that you can't get rid of, and how do you get rid of it? I work in a community mental health center. I get people that come in that want to go in a psych ward because they know it's not like alcohol. You're not in danger of dying, but you wish you were dead because of the effects. So they'd like to go to the psych ward to get the medicine and so forth. So it's a real monkey on your back. Any other questions? Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. This will be on YouTube. I'd like to thank my two colleagues, the esteemed Dr. Roberts and Dr. Nicholas Cozy. We're here to change the world, part 2.